Welcome to the Only Human Podcast, a platform for understanding what makes us human during a pandemic, through a transition, and after a crisis.
In this episode, we hear from Bianca Cassell. Her background is in psychology, and she is in the process of training to become a counselor and therapist. In her own words, she explores her queer experience as a transgender woman, reintegrating into society and making sense of normality. Bianca's view of well-being could help guide us through a transition into a post-normal world by applying concepts of flexibility and flow, of intention and consequence, of self-care and connection, and of symbolism and the imaginary.
The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. Essentially, the key idea that I struggle with, and by struggle I mean experience this continual dialectic of being challenged for almost the independence of culture and the individual, particularly in the context I have lived, the kind of almost assumption of the sort of usurpation, or the kind of, how can I put it, the individual being subsumed or consumed by the collective in collectivist cultures is something that doesn't make sense to me, because the individual still exists within the collective, even if those beliefs are different to how the individual would experience oneself as an individual in an individualist culture. So I would like to just set up an intellectual framework for a discussion. So there's just a few responses, but on quite a philosophical level. So essentially, the first thing I want to respond to, if we think of Spinoza's idea of university of being, my body and mind are literally one, and experienced through non-dual consciousness that one has access to in one's personal form of universality or God. So the question, in terms of if we're experiencing non-binary forms of movement, are opposing forces needed to restore balance? Essentially, if we look at Spinoza's idea, what he's really saying is that there are modes of being that operate within one unified substance. So the body, the mind, various trajectories of belief, of cultural and individual experience are essentially experienced within one substance, that we can be the cause of our own actions. But I don't think that an individual is capable of doing that simply through belief or simply through experience. I think there's a process of what Carl Jung referred to as individuation, and Spinoza has also referred to the idea of individuation. So one of the key ideas that I found in anthropology, which I've rejected, and I think it's one of the reasons why, as much as I do work in autoethnography, I haven't found in my own work a theory that really looks at culture in a way that I find reflects well-being. And I think really that's what my idea and what my work is about. It's about, well, okay, fine, we've got culture and we've got individual being. But surely we should be striving to a form of both that foster well-being. So firstly, difference in particular is the idea that I want to look at, because if we're not individuated, regardless of what kind of culture we find ourselves in, we can't be different if there isn't a sense of individual experience, or in the cultural or in the collective sense, a sort of unity of stance that sets up relationships between self and other. And almost paradoxically, the equality of one's sort of nodal points within that universal substance. So as an individual, I have multiple relationships, I have experiences within different cultures, and as a result, just because I say something that sounds like I agree, is there actually some sort of difference here that isn't being expressed? And that would be known as the unconscious. One of the concepts which is very important to define are notions of the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. And I think there's something very key here in terms of grief, is that subconscious sort of refers to the idea that there's this bubbling under the surface, whereas the unconscious suggests that there's something coming from a place that we don't really have any understanding of. And I think that is, in my opinion, a more accurate description, because if I'm not conscious of it, surely by definition, that means I don't understand my relationship to it. I might experience my relationship to it, but am I conscious of that relation, is a question that I think is really what grief does. It moves us in directions that we have to come to terms with. So essentially, Spinoza defines difference as power. By recognizing difference accurately, one's ability to find agency becomes effectively defined, and the capacity to, the word would be ontology, but just essentially the nature of reality, then becomes clear. And for me, reality is only clear through relationship. So then we look at ideas of difference as multiplicity, can't rent alterity. So essentially, the idea that difference just means that there's different ways or multiple ways of being doesn't set up alterity. So it doesn't set up otherness. And I think that's the point. Just because we can say, there's multiple ways of being, there's multiple forms of belief, and they all function within society. I think the key point is that ultimately, multiplicity that doesn't render alterity is actually just one with that initial substance. And there's no interrelatedness. It is the relationship between selves and others, but specific forms of relationships between self and other that look for mutual expressions of need and negotiations about those differences. I think each individual requires non-binary, non-dual experience, a connection between body and mind, and literally in the sense of I'm feeling sad, so my body feels heavy, is what I mean by non-dual and non-binary. But the binary is actually only evident in relation to another person. Within one action, there's usually more than one motivation. And in terms of the one perspective, it might be right or good, and in terms of the other, it might be wrong. I take this from an article by Hassan Birdwell, 2018. The individual is irreducible, we're original or distinct. And I would argue that that could be extended to groups and to cultures and to oppositions between constructions. But essentially what we're looking for is that irreducible originality of a whole, a coherent whole. And I think for well-being, we need to acknowledge the interrelationship between those concepts that represent groups of people. Because I think as an individual, the goal is to strive to that capacity to know exactly why one acts and for what reason and for what motivation. And within groups, it's about the negotiation that the group can do the same. And as I start becoming in relation to alterity, not to own that other. So in terms of Arundhati Roy's idea of the pandemic as portal, as part of esoteric communities, one of the ideas before this pandemic and before lockdown was go within, and we're in a moment of awakening. And the question, in a shifting social order and the post-normal, and the need to make a decision, but with varying forms of information and various forms of being able to authenticate that information. And that is, in a sense, what I'm talking about in terms of trauma and how trauma starts to permeate through culture and society. And yes, looking at historical trends can help us understand why these traumas emerge, and decolonization are attempts at a social level and even sometimes at an imaginal level to address these things. But at a personal level, that idea of individuating in relationship to grief and to healing and to trauma, we essentially look at, well, am I actually creating a sense of my own sort of distinction, my own alterity between self and other in a manner that is actually detrimental to myself? And who is anybody else to tell me that my own decisions or my own intentions are actually as a result of my own trauma. And that's where we start to get these very deep wounds that run in society. When I mention the name Jacques Lacan to certain people, I'm met by a resistance to his mathematical intellectualism. And I say it like that because, sometimes the intellectual is not a defense. It is literally a reference to being able to speak about things where I might not actually be in that state. Lacan defines, how can I put it, the sort of experience of consciousness in terms of the triangle of the symbolism, the imaginary, and the real. And essentially, the symbolic and the imaginary create this illusion to make meaning out of the real, which is essentially beyond experience. While we've set up this discourse as pandemic, as a war against the coronavirus, and I think the notion of war is very much around power and money and economic forces, as opposed to notions of healing, which I think would have been more appropriate, and kind of collective grief. But I think the idea of war is almost like, we're going to fight this, we're going to fight this, we're going to fight through this grief, we're going to fight through this sadness, and we're going to neglect the sadness of society so that we can keep fighting. So the idea of a loss of one's cultural self, an emergence of an individuated self that is capable of relation to an other, is the individual's capacity to hold loss within one's individuality, while retaining as an expression and emphasis that the singular power of the individual is irreducible, original, and distinct.
If you wish to explore the topic of autoethnography and self-analysis further, we recommend work by Pierre Bourdieu, and for more on well-being, we propose text by Gordon Matthews.
If you would like to participate in the series or ask our speakers any questions, you can reach out to us through our website or on social media at omniology_ZA.